Okay, why don't we get started? I want to thank everyone who's on this concurrent. I'm David Paris. I'm a senior advisor with the coalition, and the session is on accreditation. We have three panelists who represent different accrediting commissions, whom I'll introduce in a few minutes. I want to start by saying a little bit about why this session and why the coalition is interested in accreditation and vice versa. When I first started out with the coalition, I was trying to understand what's distinctive about this, why another organization in a space that's filled with many great people, many great organizations, Campus Compact right at the forefront. And I came to the conclusion there were two things that were distinctive about the coalition. One is the insistence that civic education and community and democratic engagement be front and center in all students' work and be really moved kind of from a periphery. Civics doesn't end at a K-12 to more central place in our understanding of the work of post-secondary education. The second is the emphasis on policy, that is consciously and intentionally trying to work with policymakers in various roles to forward this agenda with post-secondary education. The notion of policy here is a broad one. We typically think of policy as state policy and federal policy, but particularly we should with respect to the relationship of post-secondary education to K-12 education, where there are different rules, different authorities, and different ways of going about civic education. We also, of course, think about institutions as policymakers. And in a particular way, accreditation occupies a very interesting place in that mix of a broad view of policymakers. On the one hand, accreditation formally has a significant role to play in federal public policy by being connected to federal aid, of course. But in philosophy and practice, in actuality, accrediting commissions, to my mind, are really professional colleagues. They help set professional standards for institutions, and they assist in self-analysis and quality improvement for these institutions. Now, that combination, to me, suggests that they have a pretty strong level of influence with institutions. Having chaired a reaccreditation committee myself at an institution, have gone on many accreditation visits. When it comes time to for the accreditation visit, it's kind of all hands on deck. That they will pay attention, and they want to be responsive to accreditation standards. So the good news in all this is, given this position and their influence, the accreditors have welcomed the CLDE initiative. They've all signed on the core commitment statement, and they have indicated a willingness to work on this issue with us and with their institutions. I think that what we'd like to try to accomplish today is some advice and feedback, as well as developing some clarity about the role of accreditation in this process. And to that end, we've got three representatives of commissions that are going to give brief presentations, and then we will open the floor to discussion. The first presenter is Jamienne Studley. She's the president of, and I hope I usually get this wrong, but I think I might get it right this time, the Western Senior College and University Commission. I always knew it as WASC, and when the acronym changed, I needed to adjust, but I have, I think. Terence Peavy is the vice president for institutional field relations at the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, and Jeff Rosen is the vice president of accreditation relations and director of the Open Pathway program at the Higher Learning Commission. Let me turn it over to Jamie, and we'll be back for questions. Jamie?
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, David, and our colleagues, and to follow on such valuable and thoughtful sessions that took place earlier. You did a good job of describing the dual mission of accreditation, one being accountability with the somewhat tough guy sounding word of gatekeepers. But for the most part, accreditation makes a vast contribution by improvement and influence. And that is typically how these issues arise. We do set standards for quality. Those standards have evolved over time, and they now encompass the notion that, in the words of my commission, every institution should be thinking about its contributions to society and the public good. And that gives us the base from which to have the conversation that we're having today about how civic engagement fits in. Accreditation has many tools, and the toolkit may be an overused metaphor. Perhaps seasonally we could think about the gifts in Santa's bag, but let's think about how we can use various of these. My colleague at one of the at HLC, one of the other historically regional accreditors, introduced the concept of mission and purpose. And that's really where we begin accreditation. We deal with so many different kinds of institutions that accreditors are committed to applying standards that have meaning and rigor within the context of the institution's own objectives and performance. So the first step is that we always ask institutions to articulate what their mission is, and then how they act on it. How are they true to their goals? What do they do to carry out the promises that they have made to students and to their communities? And for most institutions, they either have an obligation to the state as a public institution or as a charitable institution in another way to the public. And so there's a grounding that every institution has. The power of questions is a very important theme that we talked about. Some of you I can see on the list of attendees at this session. I know one and probably multiple of you have been on accreditation teams, and you know the power of asking a question. That's true in daily life. You can reorient somebody's awareness. You can start them thinking in a new way by asking a question. But when accreditors do it, it truly focuses the mind, because we have, for better and for worse, power and authority. But we also have experience, concern, attention to these higher values, and we have an awareness of what's going on elsewhere that we can bring to the conversations with institutions. Accreditors have a history of using questions to shape change. Years ago, accreditors started asking about student learning outcomes at a time when people thought of teaching as a performative activity, and the field was evolving to say, but are students actually learning? And accreditors understood that it was our both opportunity and responsibility collectively to pursue that and to change behaviors at institutions, initially by asking questions. We also ask questions about outcomes, and that's a way in which accreditation has changed over the years from primarily looking at inputs to outcomes. And for me, one of the most promising ways to promote thinking about civic engagement and what the institution does is to tie it to the very important conversations about who graduates, who persists in schools. Are there gaps in those performances based on, yes, race and ethnicity, and also whether students come with credit from elsewhere, or whether they are attending full or part-time, or which program or which branch are they attending. Those kinds of questions shift the outcome. Who is successful here and why gets us into conversations about high impact practices, about the role of civic engagement or connection to any community to help, or the ability for students to anticipate how they will use their learning in their careers and work beyond. Many of these thoughts were raised by Barbara Gilman Danley in the previous session. And they all come under the heading of connection to student success.
Jamie, I don't know if you can hear us, but it looks like your screen is frozen. Let me give a shout out. Am I frozen? Jeff, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. And it looks
okay.
like Jamie has just signed out, and maybe she'll log back in.
Okay, well, let's give her a minute.
Okay.
The only reason I called on you, Jeff, is you were the first one whose head moved. And so I thought it would be a good test case. The rest of you are very attentive and very still. I mean, I'm not saying you're not attentive.
Jamie is back.
Oh, good.
Did you go to another speaker when I fell off? I apologize enormously.
No,
Okay, then I will wrap up. You know, it goes smoothly right until you're the one talking. I apologize to everyone for that. Let me just say that and then I look forward to the questions afterward. We see lots of ways in which accreditors can promote attention to civic engagement, as much by case studies, examples, training, modeling, and as I said, questions and inquiry. My commission decided just recently in redoing our standards that our reference to, in our very first standard, number 1, contributions to society and the public good, was a sufficient grounding and expectation for institutions, and not to be more specific than that there, but at the same time made a commitment to incorporating in our questions about outcomes in development of creative metrics to help understand postgraduate success in the richest and widest possible ways. And examples of institutions that are doing effective work in incorporating preparation for participation in a thriving democracy, that was the best way that we could see to both put the issue front and center in terms of mission and accomplishment, and to promote the kind of change that we would like to see. So thank you. Back to you, David, and I do apologize for the break.
No, thank you. That was a really great presentation. I especially like the phrase, the power of questions, and particularly when you put them in the context of that standard 1, then you really focused on it. Terence, tell us about Middle States.
Sure. First, I just want to thank you, David, for inviting me to the forum. As you joked, and I don't know if everyone heard, but David and I had the pleasure of presenting last week. Middle States had its annual conference actually last week, and around the similar topic. So I feel like I'm somewhat prepared for our conversation today. I think there are a lot of commonalities between Middle States and some of the things that my colleague just mentioned with regard, and the thing that I circled was really starting with the institution's mission. You know, it's very important for us as accreditors to not come from the top down, basically, is to work with the institutions with regard to their missions and goals, and then allow, you know, that evidence to kind of spread through the remaining standards that we actually have as well. And so when you look at the topic of civic engagement, we have actually been fairly active in this area. I actually started at Middle States roughly about a year and a half, 2 years ago. But prior to my arrival in 2019, our president, Heather Perfetti, actually worked with Campus Compact and actually did a presentation to that organization around this topic Of course, I just mentioned last week, we did a session at our conference where we focused in on civic engagement, and also highlighted 4 institutions within our membership that were really active in this area. And what I really enjoyed about it, and I obviously saw a lot of the PowerPoints prior to our conversation, but just seeing the institutions in action was just the diversity of how not only how they define civic engagement, but even the institution themselves. We had an urban research institution that was in the Philadelphia area. We had a 2-year rural community college. We also had an institution that was probably close to 20,000 in terms of student enrollment, speaking about how it's a co-curricular and curricular responsibility of this institution to promote civic engagement. And all of that is done within the confines of our 7 standards. We at this time do not have a standard that specifically speaks to civic engagement, I would say, in a silo. But I believe, and honestly saw it last week and see it all the time, that with institutions being very diverse and unique, especially in our area, we have close to 520 schools within our commission. We feel our standards allow for that ability for institutions to interpret and to have all of their goals go through them, as opposed to possibly middle states defining what civic engagement is, and allowing schools to try to fit into that box. So I look forward to this conversation today and just some of the questions that you'll bring to all of us as we learn a little bit more about how accreditors can partner with institutions along these lines.
Yeah, thanks, Terence. Following up a little bit, the theme of mission has run through the conversations we've had with accreditors all the way through, and particularly it ran through our conference. One of the institutions that presented made an important point about their rural location, that's what guided their civic work. They were going to serve the community, and it was a particular kind of community with particular kinds of needs. And I think that raises some questions about the relationship between civic engagement and institutional mission that I think are worth exploring, and I'm sure are a doorway or a point at which accrediting bodies can interact on this issue with institutions. Jeff.
Thank you, David, and thank you, my accrediting partners. Like the Western states and the Middle states, the Higher Learning Commission has the public good as front and center with respect to its guiding values. It, in fact, leads the guiding values and has done so for since 1895. But in 2020, we decided to establish the first accrediting standard affirming the importance of civic learning and an institution-wide commitment to civic engagement. And we did this within the context of mission, which you've all heard so much about. But that is really the originating point for this standard. So I thought I would read it. The institution provides opportunities for civic engagement in a diverse, multicultural society and globally connected world as appropriate within its mission and for the constituencies it serves. So it's written broadly and intentionally so to encompass a wide number of missions and a wide number of constituencies, and to place the onus on the institution to demonstrate that it is making those opportunities possible. We provide 3 guidance statements or components to this broad mission standard. The first involves the curriculum. The institution encourages curricular or co-curricular activities that prepare students for informed citizenship and workplace success. So workplace success is important. Earlier speakers have talked about teamwork, collaboration, working with partners who are different from you. The institution's processes and activities demonstrate inclusive and equitable treatment of diverse populations, and institutions have responded accordingly. The institution fosters a climate of respect among all students, faculty, staff, and administrators from a range of diverse backgrounds, ideas, and perspectives. So this climate of respect is the third important component here. And this is all elevated as part of the standard. So you can see, again, the policy established here foregrounds mission, the size and student body of the colleges and universities, and allows them to set the priorities for their campuses and communities. Many people ask, well, what is the evidence that you have for this, that this is working? And I've been working in the past year to analyze. We had some 177 evaluations of colleges and universities in our region in the past year. And I'm going to summarize now what I've learned about the evidence provided. And I'm going to expand on this in a paper that I'll present at AAC&U in San Francisco next month. So here's what I've learned. First, this policy has elevated civic engagement to a leadership role, a cabinet-level position, and an institution-wide commitment. And it's done so in a number of ways. It's led to numerous strategic planning efforts across a wide range of institutions. It has even involved state boards of regents, as in Arizona and in Kansas, and locally elected boards of trustees, and here I'm referring to community colleges. It's led to many campus-level grants and scholarship funding efforts to improve diversity and inclusion efforts institution-wide. So I think this elevation has been a significant outcome. Secondly, in the process, it has positively affected student learning. A major impact has been on the general education curriculum. Here I'm speaking broadly and condensing from a number of reports, where courses on U.S. diversity and global perspectives are now recognized cornerstones where numerous co-curricular activities have emerged to celebrate cultural diversity. And here we see a lot of variety with respect to student clubs. Obviously, large institutions with diverse tens of thousands of students have different kinds of resources to create clubs than institutions of, say, only 300 students. Other colleges and universities have expanded their relationship to their communities through dedicated outreach efforts, special internships and practicums, and new collaborations and partnerships. And in our reports, we have a great deal of detail about these kinds of extension efforts. I was once a dean of extension, so this warms my heart really to see so many different efforts in relationship to community building and collaboration. And then finally, and most encouraging, I've read now how institutions report that exit surveys and annual alumni surveys have confirmed the importance of civic learning, how graduates have assessed their college experiences in positive terms and valued their own preparation to function more effectively as citizens in our complex world today. I think when we talk about outcomes and we're able to point to some hard data, we have some convincing proof.
Oh, that's
So,
great.
David, I'll end there.
That's great, Jeff. I'm very interested in the assessment topic, and at two levels. One is how institutions are measuring it for themselves, as well as how your study mentions the impact of accreditors. I want to take the panel chair's prerogative of throwing out the first question, and I'm not trying not to overstate this question, but there seems to be, and this is perhaps just the nature of the beast. There seems to be at least a possible tension between two extremes we don't want to reject. One extreme is well stated that we're not going to hand down edicts and directives. At the other end, though, the the reliance on mission, a skeptic might say, does this mean really anything goes if you can put it under your mission? And I wonder how much any of you three feel that tension, or has it manifested itself, say, in an institution saying, but we've met this standard to our satisfaction. Please just let us go on with our work, and perhaps at the other end, either being too loose or too directive. So I know that didn't quite come out as clearly as it might, but I wonder if each of you, or at least one or two of you, could speak to that, whether you feel that tension at all, how you negotiate it, how you deal with it.
I'm
Would it
happy.
make sense for Jeff to start?
Whoever, take the mic, Jeff.
Okay. We have, when we talk about mission and diversity of our student body, of the wide range of colleges and universities, we, as the other commissions do as well, have a number of special focus institutions. Those that focus in psychology. We have art conservancies. We have seminaries that produce for the clergy, and we have medical centers. And not surprisingly, each one of these, and I did have a special component of special focus institutions that you would expect. The medical school had a number of community clinics. The law school had a free law clinic. The art students were involved in cultural diversity in the community of Kansas City, broadly speaking. Many of these institutions found a way to write a narrative and supply evidence that they were in fact pursuing their missions in the communities that they served. And they regarded this as a kind of give and take, that it wasn't just a sort of a one-way street, but rather was a way in which they could collaborate and build an understanding of their institution within their community.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, Terence, do you want to comment on this?
Jamie, you can go ahead if you're already.
Sure. David, often I have behind me on the screen here a little woodcut that says too loose and the wheels fall off, come off, and too tight and the bike won't go. And you've really described that tension whenever we try to regulate or create motion or expectation about what people will do. We look at this as an expectation that institutions will carry out the commitment they have made in their charter to us and to their community. But our commission's thought was that we want institutions to think about this as a strategy for achieving their goals for students and for the institution as a whole, not a requirement that might feel like the accreditor made me do it, but a pathway, an additional element of what makes them successful in achieving the things they have said they want to do. I think HLC's language is fine. This is not a right or wrong. It's different ways of thinking about how you get to institutions asking themselves the question, being aware of the opportunities, connecting the dots. We just simply didn't want to get an answer that felt like somebody was checking a box that they do something. We want to see the activities that they undertake to achieve student success and institutional purpose, using Yolanda's word about purpose for institutions now, as she was talking about students in the previous session, how that purpose is advanced by this kind of activity. And not to have to try and say, does it fit exactly this structure or is it enough for the accreditor, but to have an awareness and demonstrate that they have a conversation about what's their mission and how might these programs serve them going forward. I will also use this for just 1 second to say pronouncing it WASC is just fine. Consider that like our nickname. And the full title is a mouthful, but it's the WASC Senior Commission on Colleges and Universities. As we all learn more, we may identify optimal strategies for doing this. What's the right balance of expectation, language and standards, case studies, just field movement like this series of forums, complemented by hearing the same themes echoed from your accreditor, from your professional discipline, from your specialty and professional accreditors. I'll add that we represent a good band of the historically regional accreditors who operate at an institutional level. But some of that mission-driven tailoring can happen when the ABA asks law schools how they think about this, using Jeff's example, when psychology or business accreditors say, and how are you thinking about the public good in this field? Because for many faculty, that is where their attention, their curricular thinking, the integration of curricular and co-curricular and volunteer activities may come together in the most vivid way.
So I would say for middle states, am I frozen?
Terence, did you want to add anything to that?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good,
yes.
Terence.
Okay, my screen froze, so I was afraid that I had locked on. So I didn't hear the applause, so I just thought the screen was frozen. So for middle states, and I was thinking, very deeply about the question, and we have two entry points where we have this really, I would say, strategic conversation with institutions, and they typically are at the beginning of the self-study process. As vice presidents, we do what is called a self-study pre-visit, where we visit campuses to kind of go through the whole process and have a really good conversation with leaders on the campus, the president, obviously the steering committee, the board of trustees. And we're in that moment, trying to get an understanding of the consistency of message with regard to all of our standards, but I particularly say, in tune to the mission and goals part. If I hear a disconnect between what the president is saying and the board of trustees, it's something that I feel like I need to follow up on and just to really go through the document to kind of see the inconsistencies. But in most cases, it's all aligned. And through that self-study process, or I would say self-study design, which is the document they submit before writing the report, institutions list what is called institutional priorities. And that's where we start to see, the things that are important to the institution as it relates to their mission and goals. And in the case of what we're discussing today, yes, I definitely have seen schools come together and say, these are, this is a priority that we want, and you're going to see it throughout our self-study process. And in that way, it's an organic process. We obviously are not in a position to say, we like your institution priorities, but have you thought about X, Y, or Z? That's not our role, but it's basically this role of making sure that there's consistency from the beginning before we make the handoff to the peer evaluators who will obviously come to campus and do their evaluation. So I think it's more aligned with the previous presenter, who basically said that things have to emanate from the mission, but also there has to be this partnership between the institutions being aligned with this goal that they want to do, and as accreditors, just making sure that all the things are aligned so that we can go through and make sure that all the things they say they were going to do are being done.
Great. Thanks very much. Let's throw it open for questions from the floor. Would anyone like to start? Or any advice to the accreditors? Hello out there.
Actually,
I will toss
Have
that
any of you
question.
had any particular experiences with accreditors that that you think are related to this discussion? Susan, you're thinking about it. Go ahead.
You have a question there, David.
Susan? I see a hand raised.
This-
Yeah.
I was just going to say Patty Robinson had her hand up. That was all.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Patty?
hi. I had a question just before your previous question. I'm curious, and this actually goes to our WASC person. I'm at a community college in California, and as you know, we have 116 community colleges. And one of the things that we have been working on, and when I say we, it's a group of us, of trying to really get civic engagement, not just something that's out there that a few of the colleges are recognizing, but how can we start to get it recognized system-wide? And I think one of the big challenges that we're seeing is that if we are going to do that in a state the size of California with close to 2 million students that are in the community college system, we need the support coming from a larger body than, let's say, a college here, a college there. And I guess my question is, what kind of recommendation could you make to help us try and get this movement something that's going to be recognized statewide, where it's not just a handful of people who are committed and feel passionate about this, but we can actually start to get some traction at a much larger level?
Since you invited me, I will, of course, respond. As you know, but others may not know, we are not the accreditor for California community colleges. That's a different accrediting agency. I'm sure Professor Robinson knows that. The system approach that you described seems like a logical one. A second thought in the conversations that David and I have been part of relating to the how we could spread the message and infuse this into the water and higher education. One thought was statewide conversations, and a colleague on the CLDE steering committee with me from a nonprofit organization working on these issues. Have thought about whether there's a statewide either conversation to have together or a way that we can encourage people to participate in this and the follow-up forum that CLDE are managing to see whether there are other states that have been successful in that regard.
Thank you.
This might also be something that the multi-state collaborative, another initiative that CLD has started, could enter into conversations that reach statewide through. I don't know if California is a SHIO state or a NASH state. I believe it's a SHIO state, but there's several avenues for having this conversation, and I think that your point about how do we mobilize a collective action so that it isn't, as you say, over here and over here and over here. That's an important point. Other questions, comments, suggestions?
I've got a question, David, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So first of all, I really appreciate the range of interventions and levers that all three of you have raised, that underneath that the rubric of accreditation is a lot of different forms of action. By which you kind of intervene and nudge and engage and ask good questions. My question is, how do those of us who are working on change in civic education engage the accreditors? Or more generally, how is it that you come to your questions, the questions that you bring to the institutions? I've watched civic engagement become more and more important, along with student learning, which Jamie and outcomes. But how that actually happens, how your own consciousness gets changed is a mystery to me. And I think all of us who, including you all, it would be great to understand how to engage in those conversations with the accreditors as they then engage them with the institutions.
Could I take that, David? Just as a way in speaking personally, as director of the Open Pathway, I introduced this as a commitment in a quality initiative project format back in 2013. I was an academic dean and dean of extension and a professor for a long time before becoming a dean. So this gets back to David Paris's comment about accreditors being of the academy. And I think that that's an important foundation that we, in moving over to the policy world, have not lost our academic feet or foundations, but rather it's another seat at the table. And so my early partners at HLC were were Campus Compact, with which I had some earlier interactions, the American Political Science Association, and AAC&U, where I was a longtime attendee of its conferences. And so it's that, I would call it, global perspective earned of that shared, the shared priority that is sort of in various headlines here across the different themes of this conference. I think it's true for accreditors as well.
Yeah, if I could add on to that point, I mean, I think that Jeff's made a very good point there, but it's also and I think it maybe implies that it's also the case that the coalition could encourage organizations to reach out to accreditors and offer advice and assistance. So you mentioned the American Political Science Association, and I know that they've been working on the question of post-secondary civic education and are likely to come out, if they haven't already, with something. And perhaps, you know, us encouraging or facilitating those contacts would be a useful strategy for moving this along, to answer David's question, really. Jamie, did you want to add something there?
Right. We've all heard the, you know, iterate in the last few years. So we do something and then we try and do it better. We do something, we try and listen to who has an idea for improving it. So David, I would say, for example, as we think about how to evolve guides about good questions, and not just the first question, what are you doing to promote service to society and public good? What are the next questions? What are thoughtful follow-ups? And we would welcome others to either offer the first draft or to comment on the beta versions of what we do. I'll tell you a question I've got for all of you, either here or later. This goes back in part to very intense conversations Carol Geary Schneider and I had at the start of Scorecard about the limitations of the measures that we have for subtle for subtle outcomes. You can count graduation, and we're getting better at that. You can even manage to count disaggregated graduation rates, but how do you count contributions to the public good by individual students? How do you understand their sense of awareness of public activity? Do you want to, you know, the bluntest is, do they vote? That one for me has some real political downsides, because I don't want to tie this to the appearance of promotion of a particular viewpoint. And we all know the studies about voting behavior. What I'm looking for are ways to understand how this links to our definition of student success in a way that is wide and not narrow and constrained, and not overly focused on financial reward to education, but also agency in the community, leadership, service, volunteerism. expression of views on public issues, ability to comprehend public issues or to influence others. And to David Scobie, that would be a place in which the field and multiple fields could help us think about how do we know? Because each of us has spoken to how this connects back to what do students come to know and learn how to do in our institutions. And that would be a really important place to enrich the conversation, because right now we have blunt or non-existent instruments for turning that from a discussion to an understandable, analyzable, researchable question. Not just the practices at the institution, but what people can do later, do later, and even robust ways of understanding how they feel about those skills and capacities would be helpful. We can't hear you, David. At least I can't.
The assessment question looms large.
Yes.
Susan, your hand's up.
Yeah, this goes back to our previous conversation about feedback. One of the things, as actually Bobby knows we're about to do this. One of the things that my colleague Catherine Ashton, our registrar at Grinnell, and I are about to do is convene a group of 15 registrars from around the country to look at regulations in particular and how folks are interpreting them to best support community engaged learning and civic learning. And we're going to be looking at some of the HLC kinds of questions. And given what we find, what would be the best way to give you feedback? And are there things that you would be really interested to know from this particular gathering? We'll have groups of deans, registrars, and community engaged learning professional staff.
Well, speaking for the coalition, all of it. No, I think that because as you can sense, it's not that the question is new. It's we're still struggling with what are all the ways we could possibly work out, for lack of a better term, a regime of outcomes, which Jamie just described, that we understand. But so back to iterate. You're taking a first pass at that, and we'd love to be involved in it. And so, just offline, you and I should correspond, and I should get a better idea of what you're doing. And I think that is. I mean, I was sort of reminded in this conversation of the thing that came out of Gallup about, that there was a really minimalist kind of rubric, but it had influence in terms of moving the conversation. And if you can do that would be plenty. But it sounds like you've got more arrows in your quiver. That it looks like a pretty interesting project, and I'd love to work with you on it. Yeah. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. Or comments? Well, let me just go back to the panelists and ask you if there's anything else you want to add, having heard this conversation.
Yeah, I think there are additional opportunities to coordinate what Susan was talking about just most recently, and to respond to David Scobie's question earlier. With the number of institutions that are participating or making their achievements known through their different more local organizations. And here I'm referring to land grant institutions that talk to each other, the Association of Independent Colleges, and then even sort of micro independent colleges like the Associated Colleges of the Midwest that talk to each other, that share benchmarks, that share results, and that share new approaches. AAU, the Association of Research Universities, is beginning this. We have evidence through what I was collecting over the past year. And of course, community colleges as well. So I think that these are not only proving grounds, if you will, where there is a shared discourse, where practices, I won't call them best practices, but rather individual practices with shared goals are in fact shared. With the land grant colleges, almost all of them responded to the workplace achievement mandate, and tailoring, as a result, a number of their civic engagement values to helping students acquire knowledge and the ability to succeed in the complex workforce, which is dominated by diversity, equity, and inclusion. So those are important elements here. And then I think there is an additional element of cohesion in the fact that boards of regents are now considering this. So let me give you an example. In Kansas, the council, they established a council of chief diversity officers. And what that means is that all the public institutions in Kansas are sharing with individuals among who share the same title, but also the same purview for this movement, a desire to share practices across the state. That has potential to build, I think, and to be quite powerful.
Yes. Yeah, I think one of the things that I've said about the coalition at various times is that it's probably a coalition trying to encourage more coalitions. That what you're describing is in our very loose jointed system of higher education, we have no Ministry of Higher Education. We rely or hope for cooperation and professional mutual aid, if you will, to move our enterprise forward. So I think that one of the things we have to think hard about strategically as a coalition is exactly how to accomplish some of the things you just mentioned, Jeff, about encouraging cooperation and then gathering it from Susan's group and from perhaps the chief diversity officers, wherever we can find it, and push it out and encourage further coalition building and cooperation as part of the profession. I think we've hit time. I want to thank particularly our presenters, but I want to thank all of you for coming. Please get in touch with ideas, suggestions. You can volunteer, and we'll gladly work with you. And also, I'd encourage you to stay on, and because we want feedback about the learning framework that the coalition is going to put forward as kind of guiding our work. So thanks very much, and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Bye.